So welcome to the SEEKS research training for the SEEKS SIL staff. My name is Yvonne Kellar-guenther, and I'm the lead researcher and evaluator for the SEEKS project. So I'm excited to chat with you today. People that were in the face-to-face training, one of the things that we talked about was this concept of stories and people being able to tell their stories, and how SEEKS was a story in the making, and that we were all taking part in helping to write this story, and what does that look like. And one of the things that I just wanted to bring up and kind of remind people is that the research is a very important part of that SEEK storyline, right? And so we're trying to write a story around employment and getting Social Security disability benefits or Social Security benefits. But as we write that and story, one of the things that we need to do is come up with the ending. And research is really one of the ways that we can kind of come up with the ending. So let's kind of keep that in mind. And as we walk through, I'll try to refer back to that. So what I'm talking to you today about specifically is being part of a research study. So SEEKS is this innovative project that we're trying to test to see if it's worth doing in other centers for independent living and in other places in the US. And part of that question, part of that story, is the research part of that story. So we're not just doing it, we're actually doing it intentionally. We've made some design choices, and we're trying to see if we can really say at the end of the day that for 95 consumers out of 100, this is the thing that is the most helpful. So why do a research study at all, right? So as this puppy is showing us, sometimes we have good ideas that don't quite work. And so the research really helps us understand if this is something that's going to work, or if we're not really going to be jumping far enough at all. So we need the information. We need to be systematic in how we get information, so that at the end of the day, we can say, yep, this is something other SILs should be doing, or no, this isn't the answer, and let's kind of keep looking for the answer. So I'm gonna play a game with you that I call Spot the Pattern, but I'm gonna slowly give you a list of names, and you don't have to do this in the chat because there will be no chat, but you should pause the video after I give you a list of names and kind of write down your guess about how people are connected and how confident you are that you have the pattern figured out. So let's go ahead and start this. So for the first round, our list of names is John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. So take a minute, pause the video, and write down what you think the pattern is between the three men. Like, what do they have in common? That's a pattern that I'm kind of looking for. And how confident are you that you have found the pattern that I'm looking for? And you rate yourself from 0 to 100%. So go ahead and stop this, and when you're ready, start back up. All right, so I'm guessing that you've come back. So now I'm going to add another name to our list of names. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abe Lincoln. Do you agree with the pattern that you identified at the beginning? That's probably where I'm going. We have 3 more rounds, right? Do you think the other names that I'm going to reveal are going to fit into this pattern that you have? And how confident are you that, yep, this is it, you've nailed it? So again, pause the video, take a minute, and look at that. All right, I'm going to give you the third name, Martin Luther King. So our list is now John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King. So pause it. Tell me what you think the pattern is now, right? What is this list, the people that are in this list of names, what do they have in common? What's the pattern that I'm looking for? And how confident are you that you have found that pattern? Okay, so I'm assuming that you've come back. And my guess also is that your confidence went down this round. My prediction is that on round 1, you might have listed presidents. On round 2, you would have stayed with presidents probably, and your confidence would have went up because it feels like it was trending in that direction. But now I've added a name that's not a president. And so you've got another pattern that you're trying to kind of see if we're reaching that. And so here's a new name, Gandhi, right? So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Gandhi. Pause this and tell me what's the pattern and how confident you are. So I'm assuming you've come back from that. And your list has probably changed again. If you were going with famous Americans, if you write, so inspirational speakers might be your new pattern. So right? As you get more information, you're kind of changing what pattern it is that you think that I'm looking for. And your confidence, I'm going to say again, I think it went down in round 3, maybe going back up, maybe kind of staying towards the middle. Here's the last name, Aretha Franklin. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Aretha Franklin. What is the pattern? What do they have in common? And how confident are you? And if you're like most people, when you started seeing Martin Luther King and Gandhi, you might have come up with famous men. At Martin Luther King, round 3, you might have stopped and said famous Americans. But I've thrown all that off, right? So these are actually famous dead people. So the point is that that kind of shows confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is really not in your answers to the pattern, but in your confidence. And so if you were listing high levels of confidence, 70, 80, 90% confident, then you're kind of showing this confirmation bias that you feel strongly about something, you believe a certain idea, concept to be true, and so you're going to start seeing those things. And so I'm showing you different information. It might have thrown you off. You might have been like, maybe she doesn't know Martin Luther King's not a president. But you're going to kind of look to reinforce what you're looking for. So one of the reasons that we do research is we all have confirmation biases. It's really hard for us to look at stuff independently and see if there's a pattern there or not, or to understand what the underlying theme is of the pattern. And so the research helps with that. If you think about the consumers that you work with, you might think, oh, younger people are less likely to want to be on SSI, SSDI. And so that's just, I'm not even going to offer it to them because that's just how they're going to be, right? And so we change how we behave, we change how we do things, we change whether something's working or not working in our perception based on our confirmation bias, and then we start looking for evidence that those things are true. So that's why you do a research study. And our study is designed to have certain pieces to try to minimize some of those biases. So for example, our study uses 2-group design, right? One group gets to work with the treatment team or the new approach group, and another group gets to work with the business as usual group, right? So we've designed it to where we don't just have one group that gets everything. We want 2 groups, one group that gets business as usual and one group that gets a new approach, right? And that new approach is where we have staff members that are trained in benefits planning, employment, and SOAR, and they're offering those services concurrently, right? So one question you might be asking is, why do we have 2 groups instead? Why not just have one? Why not just give this to everyone? Why not let everyone have this really great, what we think is this really great intervention? And the reason is, A, we don't know, right? That's a confirmation bias if we assume that it's great. But also, we don't know which is better. And so having 2 groups, we can compare them. Having 2 groups, we could compare historically. We could look at how people have done in the past to how they're doing under this new SEEKS intervention. But things happen in the environment, and you can't really tell if they're equal. So given what's been going on right in the last 3 months, people are like, aren't you really nervous having a research study that looks at employment during COVID? And my answer is no, because I have 2 groups and one group is getting what's normally out there. And I can see if this new approach works in this environment better than the old approach, right? And so having the 2 groups takes away the impact of things going on in the environment, things going on in the community. We can hold those constant because they're exposed to roughly the same things. And then I can just see what impact the actual intervention is having. So another thing that we've done in the design is consumers who agree to be participants are randomly assigned to the team that they work with. They don't get to choose, right? And so it's another question is why? Why do random assignment? Why not just let them choose? People who want to work with the new approach can work with the new approach. People who don't. One of your answers might be that you think people will only want to work with a new approach, which isn't true. Oftentimes I see people don't like something new. They want to sometimes stay with something old. But the other thing is there's something about people who choose one group and people who choose another group, like there's something different about them. And so the best that we can do is random assignments so we can hold it constant and then they get what they get. So the random assignment takes away that whatever it is that makes you want to try something new or not try something new. And then we really have a sense, does this work for everyone, right? So between having 2 groups and the random assignment, we're starting to answer that any consumer who walks in is this a better program for them or not? Another design choice, right? Longitudinal design. So this is not people come in, fill out a survey and leave. We're working with them over years. Because the process that we're looking at spans over years. You don't just apply for Social Security and get it immediately or even within a few weeks, right? So this is kind of looking at that length of the process while people are waiting, but also hopefully we'll have that process where they have the decision and we can see how things turned out. And then we want to measure change. And so we want to measure where they come in to where they grow. And to do that, we need a longitudinal study. And so longitudinal just means long over time. So we collect data every 6 months from participants. You'll offer your services, business as usual, or the treatment services as needed, regardless, right? But we'll call them every 6 months to get data. And the nice thing is we're not bothering them too much, but we aren't going so long that they forget everything. And so that's kind of how we arrived at the 6 months. So what are our hypotheses? What are the changes that we expect to see? So we are looking at changes in a couple different areas. One is employment. So our hypothesis is that significantly, and this is statistically significant, so it means that it would be true for 95 out of 100 people, significantly more participants in the experimental services group or the treatment group will be employed in competitive integrative employment than participants in the usual care group or business as usual at the end of the project. So we expect to see one group have higher levels of employment that's more than by chance. And significantly more participants in the experimental services group will be in employment greater than substantial gainful activity. So we're hoping that they're making more also, right? So we're hypothesizing that we'll see a difference that's, again, more than chance, that they'll be employed and that they'll have higher income. For income specifically, we expect the participants in the experimental services group will report a significantly higher gross income. That's their wages and their benefits at the end of the program than participants in the usual care group. And we think that significantly more participants in the experimental services group will have a higher level of satisfaction with their income at the end of the program than participants in the usual care group. So we think they're more likely, in the treatment group, they're more likely to get employed. They're more likely to get employment that pays a little better. They're more likely to have a higher gross income with their employment and their benefits because they're going to have some benefits counseling. We think then just at the end that they're going to be more satisfied. And so we're kind of looking at income and work at all different levels, right? The impact of work on all different levels. So we're very interested, not just in are they making, a income, higher income, but are they happy about it, right? So we're trying to look at that as well. Then we're also looking at social connection, right? So part of work is social connection. So we predict that participants in the experimental services group will report a significantly greater change in social connection scores when they enter the program to the end of the program than participants in the business as usual. And we're looking at social connection in a lot of ways. It's in person, it's online, it's church, it's work, it's hobby groups. It's like all these different things. But we just think that people in the experimental or the treatment group are going to be able to make more of those social connections. We'll see if that's true. And then our final hypothesis is participants in the experimental services group will show a greater change in the highest education obtained when they enter the program to the end of the program than participants in the usual care. So maybe they're not getting work. Maybe these are people who are going and getting trade school or going and getting some certification. So we're interested in looking at that and seeing if that is also higher and a higher change. So as you look at these, if you need the slide deck, let me know. But as you look at these things, if you have any questions, if you're like, wait, I don't understand something, bring it up on one of our biweekly calls, or you can just call and email me. And I'm sorry that my email is so small. It just happens that it's really long. So I was trying to get it all on one line. But you have my email and you have my phone number, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you want answered on the hypothesis, on the research design, anything that you have. But we're not done, right? So one of the things that came up as we were doing the face-to-face training is that this is going to be hard, right? We're not dealing with people who are easy to get a hold of. we're not dealing with people who sometimes have stable housing. Some of the consumers that we work with that become participants won't have housing at all. They may be homeless. They may, be transitional in and out of places. They may have a phone. They may not have a phone, right? So it'd be much easier to have them come in, give them a one-time survey, and send them on their way. But it's okay. We're going to go ahead and spend the effort. So enrollment's hard. The longitudinal data is hard. Having a business as usual group is hard, right? Because we think people are going to want the new, which is not necessarily true, but it feels hard to keep that. And having a randomized study design is hard. We can't tell them what group they're going to be in, but it's worth it, right? We're doing a project where people with disabilities get to tell us their experiences, help us write their story to reflect what they're seeing and how it's working for them. And I've been in this field for a while. This is not my first research study on employment for persons with disabilities. I've never done a project where I don't get the data directly from the persons with disabilities, but that was not the norm when I first started in this field. I don't even know that it's fully the norm now. It's much easier for me to ask you if you think it's working. It's much easier for me to go to employers and see if it's working, right? They're easier to get information from, but we really have to get the information from the people that this is impacting, and that's the consumers, right? So your consumers are a group we rarely hear from. They're hard to reach, but they have important stories to tell, and we need to try to help tell their stories. And then we're going to need your help. We have to get a hold of them, so you're going to have to help us. And sometimes we'll call you and say, we're having a hard time meeting with so-and-so, and you might be able to help us kind of get in touch with them again. So this is our chance to ensure that the story about employment and getting benefits is told for consumers of centers for independent living. Like, that's just a group we haven't heard a lot from. But to do that, we need to believe in the model of the SEEKS values, and we need to model it. So we need to believe in and model the SEEKS values. So we can't just say the SEEKS values, which was in an earlier education piece. And if not, we can do it in a weekly meeting if you haven't heard them. But we need to believe in those values. We need to model them. We need to respect the privacy and confidentiality of participants. So in a future module, I'm going to talk to you about privacy and confidentiality. And you'll all have a little face-to-face session on privacy and confidentiality. Actually, that's how you're going to get that. It's not going to be in a videotaped module. And then we just need to adhere to the fidelity of a study as much as possible. And that's like a bunch of words, but we need to do the program as true as we can to the intent of the program. And I'll talk about that in a future module for you. So we need to do the research as well as we possibly can. The worst thing we can do for people is spend their time, spend tax dollar money, and have people throw out our findings because they think that we've missed something. And so we need to do as strong a test as we possibly can to make sure that at the end of the day, most people, there's always going to be someone, but most people are like, yep, that makes sense. That really was a good test and that doesn't work, or that really was a good test and that does work, or and that's good information. We can actually do that in our study, or we don't want to do that in our area. So here are the things that makes for a strong hypothesis, right? One is that the research is rigorous, right? So we need to adhere, like I just said, to the philosophy of SEEKS. We need to deliver the intervention in the way that it's been designed, which is that concurrent, simultaneous service delivery. We need to have all the pieces. We need to keep the groups separate. Someone who's been trained in the intervention or the new approach should not be delivering services for someone who's in the control group. Someone who's in the intervention group shouldn't be getting business as usual services. They should be getting it from this team that's been trained to deliver services concurrently. We need to be systematic. So that's why we have the randomization. We don't let people pick and choose what they want to be. We're systematic. If you walk in that door and you sign up for that study, we systematically have a way to make sure we can get in touch with you. We systematically have a way to make sure the data is collected, right? So we get data every 6 months. We're going to try to reach out to someone. That's part of our systematic way. We have a peer data collector. That's part of our systematic approach. We need to make sure it's valid. So we need to measure, so when we talk about there being a change, we need to have the data collected in a way that it's a valid change. So it's true, right? So when you step on the scale and the weight that it gives you, it should be a valid weight. It should not be that the scale is off 5 pounds or whatever. Same thing. So if there's really a change, we need to know that we're really seeing a change. So that's why we ask people when they first join the study where things are at, so we know where they started before they got the intervention. And that's why we gather data every 6 months to reduce recall bias, because that makes our data as valid as possible. We need to make sure that it's verifiable, that someone else coming in and looking at what we've done can be like, yep, you delivered business as usual, just like you've always been delivering business as usual. You're delivering the treatment as you've designed it. You know, we get the data in the same way. It's like, hey, you know, how do you reach out to people? How do you decide who's in the study? How do you approach? All that needs to be verified. And so we have ways to document that information so that we can make sure that it's as consistent as possible. And we have a paper trail. So one of the things we'll do is when you get training, we will actually write that down so that someone can say, yep, you were trained on this day. Good to know, right? Needs to be empirical, meaning there's no guessing. There's not a does this feel right? It's data. We decide if this is working or not based on the data. And so that's what makes this empirical. And I've said this a few times, but if we did this with 100 people, would it be true for 95 of them? And if the answer is yes, it's a pretty strong empirical test. It's critical. We do not assume the outcome. So we don't know if this is going to work or not. And you might need to believe that it works or doesn't work, depending on kind of your role in the study. That is not my job. My job is to be convinced by the data and to gather data that other people looking at it can also be convinced by the data and not by you. So that's the part of the critical piece. So for our test to be rigorous and valid, we need to make sure that what we're comparing, what would happen if nothing was different, to the new approach. And the bigger the differences between them, the better, the more likely we are to see something if it's really there. So there's different types of errors in research. And one is that there's a difference, but you don't actually capture it because it's not big enough. And one is that you see a difference that isn't really there. So we're really worried about not seeing a difference, even though it's there, right? So one of the things is, we have version this program A that we're trying, and this is a white box, right? Program A we're trying. And if program B is what kind of already exists, that's not a very strong test. And actually, let's say that A, because I'm going to keep A up there. So A is what already exists. B, if B is our new program, B is our treatment, there's not enough difference between them that we may not see it. We may not actually see that something's there, but it is there and we'll miss it, and that will be sad. What we really want is we want to be able to compare A in the white box to C or D, right? Which would be our new approach or treatment or our new way of doing things. We want to see, as you can see, C is kind of a dark gray and D is a black box, right? We want them to be different enough to then, boy, if you saw that, if someone walked up to you and said, are A and B different, you might have to stop and think. But if someone said, hey, is A different than C and A different than D, you would know. And that's what we want. We want what we're comparing to be different enough that we'll actually be able to see the difference in the data. So the other thing that we're really worried about, and that we'll talk to you a lot about, is contamination. And so we really want to make sure that staff who are doing business as usual aren't contaminated by staff who are trained in the treatment approach, and that participants who are doing in the business as usual group aren't contaminated by participants in the treatment as usual group. So, and contamination bias is when a member of the control group starts getting exposed to some of that new stuff. Hey, you know, our benefits counselor for the control group, the person we're referring to, they've got kind of a backlog. Go ahead and see the person who's been trained in the treatment approach. That's not a great thing to do. So I'm going to show you a difference. So this is, our cat has been contaminated by our dog. And so look at how the cat acts. And one of my questions that I asked her in the live training is, can you teach a cat to sit? And how would you teach a cat to sit? But here's our cat. So what you've noticed is that the cat and the dog both sit for a treat. And you might think, wow, she took the time to train her cat. And the answer is, I did not take the time to train my cat. What happened is that my cat learned by watching my dog, and the cat's like, oh, I want to do that. I want a treat. So now the cat sits like the dog. That was not purposeful. We were not looking to try to train our cat to sit like a dog. It just ended up kind of happening and we noticed it. So our cat has been contaminated by our dog, and there's positive things like, hey, our cat comes when called and sits for a treat. That's awesome. The dog's also taught our cat to beg. So there's good and bad contamination, right? But you want to minimize contamination, because if we have contamination, then what we end up with is our A block being compared to our B block, because they look very similar, versus our A block being compared to our C or D block. So how do you ensure that your site that the control group only is working with the business as usual staff, at the treatment group work with the staff who are trained as part of SEEKS? And so each of your sites has a different approach. But I know that we've asked that there be documentation and records, that they have different color folders, right? So there's different ways that you can try to control for this, but you should be asking for that. You should be asking, how do we make sure that our control group isn't working with treatment, and that our participants in the business as usual group isn't working with, well, participants in business as usual, which is your control, is not working with treatment, and people in the consumers in treatment are not working with staff who deliver control services. And what the other part that you'll notice on this slide is the control group only work with business as usual staff. The only has an asterisk. You're going to have to make referrals. And if you would normally make a referral, whether you were in the study or not, then you would still kind of do that. So just at your site, talk about how you're going to make sure, how you're going to minimize contamination uh, amongst yourselves and amongst the participants, and talk to us about it. Talk to the SEEK staff. So that is the end of this first part. And this is, if you have any questions, again, we're not able to do this interactively, but you can bring it up on the biweekly calls. You can reach out to me with questions, but kind of think through, like, what did you learn today that surprised you that maybe you didn't know? Maybe you didn't know what our hypotheses were. Maybe you didn't know that a cat could sit. And then think about what concerns you have about being part of a research project, right? There's things about it. This isn't the norm. It's not what people are used to. Is there something that bothers you? And if there is, go ahead and bring that up with us. So thanks for taking time to meet with me. And I look forward to talking to you in an actual meeting.